Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Friday, the 16th of August in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, as Western nations ratchet up tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and chip technology, the country's central bank offers caution on stimulus.
Goldilocks returns. Traders scale back bets on Fed rate cuts as the latest US economic data defies expectations.
Plus, as Gaza ceasefire talks restart in Doha, calls to reconstruct the territory are growing louder, but it's not clear who will pick up the $80 billion bill.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
European Union tariffs slowed the influx of Chinese-made electric vehicles in July as the bloc moved to protect its car makers from low-cost competition. According to research from Dataforce, the number of new EVs that Chinese manufacturers like BYD registered in the EU last month fell 45% month on month. While the drop may have been exaggerated by car makers rushing to get EVs to dealers before the added levies took place, it reflects growing trade friction between Western countries and the world's second largest economy.
Well, the latest data comes as China faces increasing economic headwinds at home, underscored by faltering domestic demand and a prolonged downturn in the housing market. On Thursday, the country's central bank chief pledged further steps to support the economic recovery in China, whilst cautioning that it won't be adopting extreme measures. Bloomberg's Min Lo has more.
The governor, Pan Gongsheng, he gave an interview to state media and he made some rather ambiguous comments. He talked about the need to maintain policy stability and patience, that there shouldn't be drastic easing or drastic tightening. Now, obviously, the state of the Chinese economy now doesn't warrant any drastic tightening, given the rather lackluster economic data that we saw yesterday. Slight rebound in retail sales, but that was from a very low base in June, and an unexpected decline in fixed asset investment as well.
Well, that was Bloomberg's Min Lo. President Xi Jinping's government is targeting growth of about 5% this year as policymakers try to shake off a post-pandemic slump. However, economists say that the government will need to accelerate spending on infrastructure and other programmes if that target is to be realised.
Traders are shredding bets on big Federal Reserve rate cuts and Treasury yields surged following signs of US economic resilience. Retail sales accelerated in July by more than forecast in the US, suggesting consumer strength, despite higher prices and borrowing costs. Matt Miskin, co-chief economist at John Hancock, says the situation is beneficial for investors.
We are now back to good news is good news, and in our view, and we're moving out of that really conundrum type market responses we used to get, where it'd be like, okay, this is bad news, but now all of a sudden rates are lower. That's helping small caps. Good news is good news again for growth. For an asset allocator, that's great news. You know, it's been really messy.
John Hancock's Matt Miskin speaking there. Fed Chair Jerome Powell will speak next week at the annual Central Bank Symposium in Jackson Hole before the next US Labour report is released in early September.
Well, as for the US presidential race, Joe Biden joined Democratic nominee Kamala Harris on the campaign trail. It's the first time that the two have appeared together since Biden ended his own re-election bid and endorsed his current VP. Harris was full of praise for her former running mate.
It is my eternal and great honor, I have to tell you, to serve with this most extraordinary human being and American and leader, our President, Joe Biden.
Kamala Harris there speaking at a campaign event. Elsewhere, the Republican candidate Donald Trump held a press conference at his New Jersey golf club. The former president used the event to criticize his opponent.
As far as the personal attacks, I'm very angry at her that she'd weaponized the justice system against me and other people. Very angry at her. I think I'm entitled to personal attacks. I don't have a lot of respect for her.
Donald Trump speaking there. Biden and Harris together on the campaign trail could offer Trump an opportunity to tie them together on issues where he perceives an advantage, including on immigration and on the administration's economic record. As the US economy continues to defy expectations, though, Trump's lead on that issue in particular has shrunk in comparison to Kamala Harris.
In the UK, victims of the contaminated blood scandal are set to begin receiving payouts. The government has confirmed that some may be entitled to up to £2.5 million. Bloomberg's James Wilcock has more.
It has been decades since thousands were infected with diseases including HIV and hepatitis C, caused by infusions of contaminated blood given between the 1970s and 1990s. Roughly 1 in 10 of those affected have since died. All the victims and their families are entitled to lifelong compensation and support. Kate Burt is Chief Executive of the Haemophilia Society. She wants to know how the sums were arrived at.
How do you put a value on a child that's died? How do you put a value on your life being destroyed by chronic hepatitis? We hope to see a lot of clarity around where these numbers came from. Was it a legal framework? Was it a medical framework?
The new government has confirmed those affected will start receiving damage payments by the end of this year. The commitment was never in question, but it will be an added strain on an already stretched British state. In London, James Wilcock, Bloomberg Radio.
Now to the Middle East. As Gaza truce talks begin in Qatar, Bloomberg has set out the enormous challenge of rebuilding the Strip. More than 70% of the area's housing is reportedly damaged, with most of the territory's 2.2 million people now displaced. The first task would be in reconstruction, the removal and sorting of some 42 million tonnes of rubble. Gerald Feinstein is a former US ambassador to Yemen. He predicts difficult discussions as part of any ceasefire deal.
The death and destruction in Gaza continue to mount. And also, of course, according to the Iranians, there's a linkage between the peace talks, the ceasefire talks in Gaza, and the likelihood of Iranian retaliation against Israel for the Haniyeh assassination.
That was Gerald Feinstein speaking there. Israeli officials say it's too early to comment on reconstruction. Even if a peace settlement is ever reached, rebuilding Gaza is estimated to cost more than $80 billion. Now, in a moment, we'll talk more about the Chinese economy and those figures on electric vehicle imports into Europe, plus our deep dive report into how Gaza could be rebuilt when the war ends. But first, there was another story that caught our eye this morning.
This is the trend of the remote CEO. So the new boss of Starbucks isn't moving to Seattle, where its headquarters is located. He's going to stay living in California and commute to and from the coffee chain's HQ. The company says Brian Niccol will spend most of his time in Seattle, and he'll get to use the corporate jet for the journeys back and forth.
Right.
Then there's Hillary Super at Victoria's Secret, who is moving from California to New York to take up the CEO position there. But the lingerie company's headquarters are actually in Columbus, Ohio. So this is a trend that we're seeing of corporate leaders being given the option to run their businesses from hundreds or thousands of kilometres away, at least some of the time. And part of the ongoing maybe evolution of workplace flexibility. I think people who work in companies who have been told to go back to the office might not be terribly happy to hear that CEOs are being able to move somewhere else.
Starbucks barista, I think, yes. Would that bother you? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that the companies have been grappling with, because it's a question, of course, true of attracting the best talent to take up these very important jobs. A Victoria's Secret spokesperson said to Bloomberg that they have headquarters in many locations, including New York, and for them, what's most important is their teams feel supported no matter where they're based. But perhaps could be an interesting debate for someone who's being told that they have to be in office a certain number of days a week.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's one of the pieces on the Bloomberg terminal then, the state of the world of work today. Right, let's also turn our attention, though, to China. The central bank chief has pledged to do more to support the economy after a week of economic data that highlighted continued weakness in China. This as the new figures for Europe show registrations of new Chinese-made electric vehicles in EU countries has fallen by almost half as the tariffs have taken effect. Our executive editor for Greater China, John Liu, joins us now for more. John, great to have you on the programme. In terms of the EV story first, what does the data show about sales of Chinese EVs? And much of the problem does seem to be being posed really to Chinese EV makers.
I think it shows the impact is quite noticeable. Even you talked about it a little bit before, the 45% fall from July from June. I think that's probably a little exaggerated, given that people knew these tariffs were coming into place. And so there was an effort to get cars into Europe and sold. But I think it didn't take away from the fact that going forward, it's going to be much harder for these companies to sell their cars in Europe. I think it's really interesting that in this data, we saw that BYD actually did quite well. So BYD in July sold 3 times more cars than they did a year ago in Europe. And so BYD is building a big factory in Hungary. It's also got the smallest tariff being imposed on it among all the Chinese car makers. So I think that suggests to me that you're going to see more Chinese car makers start to move production to Europe because they see Europe as being a very important market, given the U.S. is basically shut off to them. So I think that's what we will continue to see in the future.
John, on the broader economic picture facing China, the central bank governor has said that he'll help, but it won't be drastic. What should we read into that?
I think the central bank governor was trying to accomplish 2 things. So on one hand, he's sort of saying, things are all right. We've done these things in terms of policy steps to address the slowdown. If we need to do more, we will do more. So we have things under control. So trying to give markets, consumers here in China some bit of confidence. But at the same time, I think he was trying to set expectations that Beijing is not pulling out the bazooka. There's not going to be some gigantic, enormous stimulus coming down the pike. And so trying to get those 2 messages across at the same time.
Yeah. And then can you put together what we've learnt this week about the Chinese economy in terms of the outlook now?
So I would say the data that we've gotten so far would show that the economy is losing momentum. And I think the piece of data that really highlights this is investment. There was a surprise slowdown in fixed asset investment. The problem with China's economy has been the consumer, the housing crisis. People are not spending money. And so the big hope was that the government would open up its coffers and start to spend and get the economy going again. And that spending really should be showing up in the data in the form of investment. But if investment is now slowing down, that's really a cause for concern because that was supposed to make things better. And so that is why I think we are a little bit more worried now than we were a month ago.
Okay, John Liu, our executive editor for Greater China, thank you very much for joining us.
Now, today's Bloomberg Big Take report looks at the costs and challenges of rebuilding Gaza when the war between Israel and Hamas finally ends. After 9 months of conflict, there are more than 42 million tonnes of rubble across the Strip. Removing that will be the first stage of any reconstruction project. Our reporter Fadwa Hodali joins us now from Bethlehem in the West Bank for more on this piece. Lots of deep reporting on this. Fadwa, firstly, talks are happening in Qatar. What hope is there of the war ending?
Well, while expectation of a breakthrough remains low, the talks are crucial for preventing further escalation and on the regional conflict. The situation is complex, with issues like Israel is demanding a continued control of the Gaza-Egypt border, the restriction on displaced Gazan to return to the northern Gaza. Hamas continues to demand a complete cessation of fire, of ceasefire, a complete withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, the return of displaced Gazan without any conditions. So the situation is complex. Let's hope for a breakthrough, but challenges are still persisting in there.
Turning to your reporting now on the reconstruction of Gaza eventually, the story shows in visual terms one of the really key challenges, and that's the rubble that's been left from buildings that have been destroyed. Can you explain the scale of this and what would be needed then to remove that?
The scale is tremendous. You can imagine 42 million tons of rubble in 10 months, and the war has not ended yet. And challenges, you have unexplosive ordnance under the rubble. Estimation of 20,000 bodies still under the rubble. The pollution that this is going to cause in there. So you just can imagine the manpower that you need, the machinery that you need in order to remove all that. And these are challenges. 80% of the machinery has been destroyed in the Gaza Strip. And you require new machinery. You require teams to go on the ground. We are talking about all estimates. This is not, war has not ended. So you can imagine if there will be no ceasefire, the amount of rubble that would also accumulate, the amount of unexplosive, the dead bodies that this all is affecting the soil, the people, the health system, the sanitary system. So everything is affecting that. And not to forget the biggest challenge of this, if a ceasefire takes place, this all requires coordination. You cannot start working into the rubble and removing rubble and doing anything without coordination. Coordination is a must because Israel controls the borders. And in order for the machinery to enter into the strip, this has to be approved by the Israeli government. So everybody has to work into making sure that there will be a plan that will be agreed on by all parties. And when we talk about all parties, and the piece that we worked on, it would be the UN agencies. UNDP is heavily involved into this because they've been having the previous experiences before. The Palestinian Authority, the donor country, civil society, and the Israeli government. Without its approval, none of this will happen.
In terms of the rebuilding, I mean, just the beginning of the rebuilding would be to remove the rubble. In terms of the cost, what are the cost estimates of how this could be done?
Well, the costs are estimating it about $80 billion for cost, and this is only just an estimate, and war has not ended. So you can imagine you need funding, you need people to commit to that, and you need the teams to go inside Gaza, evaluate, good evaluation in order to estimate how this process will be paid for. But there's a major challenge. First of all, ceasefire has to take place, and then the rubble process will start. Without a ceasefire, none of this is going to happen. We can talk from now till a long time, but without a ceasefire, this cannot be removed.
Fadwa, you spoke to people in Gaza for this reporting. Do they have any hope for what Gaza's future could look like?
With the war continuing, people will lose hope. But Gaza people want hope, want peace, want stability, want this to end. They don't want wars anymore. They have endured so many wars, not one or two or three. So there might look like they are desperate, and they are desperate, but hope always have to be there. And this what can bring the Gazans back. This what can rebuild Gaza back is people have to continue to have the hope for peace and for stability and for them.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.